My wife froze, speechless, when she saw me standing at the restaurant door, staring at her and the man with her. It was as if time had stopped, as if the clink of glasses, the laughter, the sound of cutlery, and even the background music had been swallowed by a deafening silence. I said nothing. I didn't scream, I didn't make a fuss, I didn't cry. I just stared at her. Her eyes wide, she couldn't hide her nervousness at being caught off guard. The man next to her, visibly uncomfortable, didn't even know how to react. And in that moment, when everything inside me was shattering into 1,000 pieces, I simply turned my back and walked away. I left feeling that life as I knew it was over. The woman I loved, who once looked me in the eye and promised fidelity, loyalty, love, was now a stranger. That scene, that table, that posture, she wasn't being forced, she was there by choice. Dining, laughing, smiling like a couple. That image haunted me for days, invading my dreams and waking up with me every morning. I spent the first 2 nights awake, staring at the ceiling of a cheap hotel room. And it was there, between peeling walls and a hard mattress, that I realized the love I felt for her was real, but the love she claimed to feel for me might never have existed. I began replaying every "I love you" I heard, every kiss before bed, every good morning message that now seemed programmed. Was it all true? Or just part of a comfortable routine? The pain came not only from betrayal, but from doubt. What was real? What was staged? And worst of all, how long had this been going on? It hurt to imagine that while I was dedicating myself to our future, someone was taking my place in the present. And the cruelest thing was realizing she hadn't expected to be discovered. That scene wasn't a trap. She was at ease, without apparent guilt, without fear of being seen. It wasn't a one-time mistake. It was repetition. On the 3rd day, with trembling hands and an empty soul, I wrote a divorce letter. No beating around the bush, no long justifications. I simply communicated my decision. I was tired of fighting for a love that only existed on one side. I was exhausted trying to keep alive a relationship she had let die without telling me. I handed the letter to a lawyer and asked for it to be filed immediately. I needed to turn this page before she ripped up the entire book of my life. The next day, she received the envelope. She called me. 23 missed calls. Then messages, audio messages, emails, even a handwritten letter. In all of them, the same phrase, "Let me explain." But what was there to explain? I saw it. With my own eyes. I felt it. With my own heart. Love doesn't survive contempt. And she despised me when she chose to sit at that table with another man as if I had never existed. Days later, she appeared at the door of my new home. Her hair hastily tied back, no makeup, wearing that old blouse I loved so much. Her eyes were puffy, red, as if she hadn't slept in days. She was crying before she could even speak. She reached out, tried to touch me, but I recoiled. Not out of anger. But out of self-protection. I couldn't allow the same heart she'd broken to make me forget everything so quickly. She said it had been a mistake. That she was confused. That she felt neglected. That it was all the fault of a moment. But what about dinner? And the laughter? And the passionate glances? That wasn't impulse. It was surrender. It was decision. She begged me to listen. To understand. She said that man meant nothing. That only now did she realize the depth of the hole he'd dug between us. But it was too late. Something inside me had changed. I forgave her. I looked into her eyes and said, "I forgive you. But I can't go on." Forgiveness was liberating. For me. Not for her. She hoped for redemption. She hoped for a second chance. But the love that once made me move mountains now only made me want peace. And that night, she left. And I closed the door, certain that I would never be the same again. She cried. She called me back. She stood on the sidewalk, waiting for a reaction. But I no longer reacted to the pain she caused. Because forgiving isn't going back. Forgiving is setting free. And that's what I did. As the months passed, she tried to get closer. She sent messages on special occasions. She discreetly commented on social media. She asked about my health. And I responded politely, but without nostalgia. While she sank into regret, I rediscovered my essence. I rediscovered the pleasure of being with myself, of living without anxiety, of not waiting for someone else to come home to feel complete. I relearned how to smile effortlessly. How to sleep without a guilty conscience. How to look in the mirror and see someone whole, not just a piece of me begging for love. One day, out of the blue, I ran into her again. I was in a coffee shop, reading a book, when she walked in. Our eyes met. She hesitated. She walked over to me. We smiled. No pain. No resentment. She asked if she could sit. I agreed. We talked for a few minutes. She told me she still thought about me. That no man could ever fill my shoes. That what she experienced with me was irreplaceable. And that if she could go back in time, she would have acted differently. I said nothing. I just listened. And at the end of the conversation, she asked, "Do you already love someone else?" I answered sincerely, "I love myself. And that is enough." She smiled sadly. She knew she'd lost me. And in that moment, she understood that betrayal hadn't just stolen the man who loved her. It had stolen the future we could have had together. She walked slowly out of the coffee shop. I stood there, finishing my coffee. At peace. Knowing that the past no longer controlled me. And that, even though my heart still remembered, my mind had already moved on. But, what could have led her to betray a true love? What was behind that seemingly casual dinner with a stranger? And why did she only realize everything she'd lost, when there was no turning back? Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't support any kind of cheating, on the contrary, we use stories fictional and realistic to show how infidelity can destroy homes, loves and entire lives. Each narrative is a warning, a mirror of the consequences that many ignore until it is too late. Get ready, what you're about to hear is a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. His name was Daniel. He was 38 years old, quiet, soft-spoken, and with restrained gestures, but with a look that always conveyed more than it spoke. He worked as a systems analyst at a mid-sized company and led a stable life, without luxuries, but with dignity. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with his presence, but his absence always left a noticeable void. He had a peculiar sense of humor, the kind few understand, but those who do, never forget. He enjoyed the little things, taking a walk in the late afternoon, making fresh coffee in the morning, tending to the plants on the balcony, and organizing his bookshelf by feeling, not by author or genre. For him, books had a soul. And feelings too. Sophia had been his wife for 11 years. A head nurse at a respected hospital, she was known for her efficiency, empathy, and firmness. She was the kind of person who spoke with eye contact, with a voice that conveyed reassurance even in the most uncertain moments. Her colleagues admired her, her patients thanked her, and at home, she was the center of balance. Sophia had always been a woman passionate about life, intense in the details, and firm in her decisions. From a young age, she learned to fight for everything she wanted and was never afraid to face adversity. When she met Daniel, it was as if the world had finally slowed down so she could breathe in peace. He, with his calm, and she, with her determination. Two polar opposites that complemented each other in an almost poetic way. They lived in a two-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The place had a balcony, lots of plants, and a silence broken only by the sound of the wind in the leaves or the laughter of a child in the neighboring building. It was the kind of home that seemed to live in its own time, oblivious to the hustle and bustle outside. On the walls were photographs of simple but meaningful trips, a dirt road, a cloudy afternoon in the mountains, an improvised breakfast in bed. There was no ostentation, just memories. And on Sundays, the routine was almost sacred. Daniel would make pancakes, Sophia would put on a soothing playlist, and the two would divide their time between the couch, their plans, and the comfortable silence of those who didn't need to speak to understand each other. Their relationship was based on respect. Not the usual formal kind, but a deep respect for each other's individuality. Sophia knew Daniel needed his moments of introspection, his solitary coffees, and his immersion in books she could never finish. He, in turn, understood her emotional urgencies, the long days, the nights she cried in the shower without saying why, the times she simply needed to be heard, not fixed. They were never a couple for grand public displays, but there was a complicity between them that manifested itself in the details, the way she adjusted the collar of his shirt before leaving, or how he always left the hallway light on for when she came home late from work. Sophia came from a troubled family. She grew up in an environment where love was exchanged for obedience, and emotional stability had always been an uncharted territory. So when she found in Daniel the safe haven she'd never had, she clung to it like someone trying to hold sand between their fingers. Over the years, she learned to trust, to allow herself to be cared for, but there was always a quiet restlessness within her, a fear of losing herself in a routine that didn't scream, but also didn't surprise. Daniel, on the other hand, was the son of a discreet and loving couple, who grew old together reading the newspaper on Sundays and having tea at 5. He grew up believing that love manifests itself more in constancy than in fire. Perhaps that's why the idea of overwhelming passion never moved him. For him, love was permanence, it was construction. Even with busy lives, they always made an effort to maintain connection. They had a habit of dining together, without cell phones on the table, and of sharing the day's events. Sometimes it was lively conversation, other times just "it was hard today," and a touch of hands that said more than words. Sex between them was never explosive, but it was honest, intimate, and safe. Over time, as in many marriages, predictability emerged. There were fewer surprises, but there was peace. And while this calm was the desire of many, for Sophia, it sometimes sounded like a muffled whisper amidst the noise of the world. It wasn't open dissatisfaction, but a faint longing for something she herself couldn't name. A desire that didn't nullify love, but that cast doubt on it in moments of profound silence. Daniel had noticed some changes in Sophia, especially in recent months. There were long glances out the window, pauses in thought mid-sentence, and an absence that wasn't physical, but emotional. She smiled less. She slept facing away from him. She responded more slowly. But he attributed this to the strain of work, the pressure of the hospital, the emotional burden the pandemic had left on her shoulders. He never considered anything beyond that. He was never an insecure or controlling man. He believed that trust was the foundation of everything, and that invading the privacy of someone you love is more a cry of desperation than a proof of love. That's why he never went through her phone, never questioned her schedule, never even doubted her words. On her side, there was a silent struggle. Sophia felt out of place within the stability she so longed for. She was proud of Daniel, of the relationship they'd built, of the home they'd made together, of the memories, but there was a void growing inside her that knew no name. Sometimes, in the shower, she wondered if she was living or just existing. If loving someone was enough when she no longer felt part of her own story. She missed something she couldn't describe, a kind of spark, an instinct, a desire for something that would break the monotony and bring her back into contact with her own skin. But she also felt guilty about it. Because there was nothing wrong. There was no yelling, no betrayal, no disrespect. There was affection. And perhaps that's why the anguish was greater. How could she complain about something that seemed perfect? At the hospital, Sophia was respected and loved, but the emotional pressure and living with pain had made her more introspective lately. She spent hours treating critical cases, dealing with loss, and trying to maintain others' balance while feeling her own slip. She began leaving later, using fatigue as an excuse to arrive after dinner, to avoid conversations, to sleep earlier. Daniel patiently kept the candles burning in their relationship, unaware that she no longer felt the warmth of the flame. He continued to leave coffee ready in the morning, send loving messages in the middle of the day, and propose short weekend getaways. But all of this met with an invisible wall, a barrier that grew without him understanding why. And so the days piled up. Between the delicacy of a stable love and the weight of growing silence. Daniel still smiled when he saw her arriving, still watched her from afar as she took off her shoes and tied up her hair, as if for the first time. I still made lists of movies to watch together and wrote down places to visit on vacation. And Sophia. Sophia sometimes cried alone, sometimes smiled automatically, sometimes just kept quiet. She was still moved by some memories, but no longer knew how to create new ones. She still loved him. But she felt there was something inside her that needed to be faced, even if she couldn't name it. Until one day, amidst the peaceful routine and the silence that inhabited the house like an invisible guest, something happened. Something that would gradually put everything into perspective. Something that would reveal not only the flaws in the relationship, but also the limits of forgiveness, the pain of loss, the transformation of identity, and the true measure of love. But for now, there was just this, a couple that seemed whole on the outside, but on the inside began to crack slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a structure that resists the winds on the outside, but already hears the internal cracks of its own fragility. And soon, one of them would discover that some choices are irreversible. And that love, no matter how strong, doesn't survive everything. Especially when the choice stops being between staying or leaving, and becomes between forgetting or resisting. Daniel woke up that Tuesday to the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee, but for the first time in months, he noticed her cup was missing from the counter. Still warm, still untouched. It was the kind of detail that would go unnoticed by many, but not by him. It represented absence. Sophia always drank her coffee before leaving, even when in a hurry, even if it was just 2 sips standing up, between a bag and a lab coat. That morning, the absence of the cup was like an uncomfortable whisper in his routine, a silent presence telling him something had changed. And as much as he tried to ignore it, Daniel carried that discomfort for the rest of the day, like a pebble in his shoe that bothered him more emotionally than physically. He texted her to ask if everything was okay, and she replied 2 hours later with a simple, "Sorry, busy day." He didn't insist. He wasn't the type to demand attention. But the prolonged silence within him was beginning to resonate. The following days continued with an unsettling normality. Sophia began leaving earlier and returning later. When questioned, she talked about a new demand from the hospital, about more demanding shifts, unexpected meetings, revamped protocols. Daniel, sensitive and discreet, accepted everything. But something in him began to observe her more cautiously. Her clothes, her perfume, which was more intense than usual, her long showers before leaving, the way she styled her hair, the way she checked her reflection in the hallway mirror before walking out the door. None of these gestures alone meant anything serious, but together they outlined a new behavior. Something in Sophia was changing. And it wasn't just work fatigue. It was as if she was building a new version of herself. A version where he was no longer a part. One morning, when he woke up thirsty, Daniel passed by the living room and saw her cell phone light on the table. She had fallen asleep and forgotten it there. He hadn't intended to intrude, but as he picked up the phone to place it on the counter, the screen lit up. A message notification with the name of an unknown contact appeared briefly before the screen went dark. Hesitantly, he approached, and the light came back on. He didn't need to open anything. He just read the passage, "Last night was perfect. I can still smell you." The sentence burned his eyes as if written with a hot iron. His hand trembled. His heart raced strangely, as if something inside him were silently tearing apart. He stood there for a few seconds, staring into space, trying to understand what he had just seen. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a text from a friend. It was something too clear. Too intense. Too intimate. He placed the phone on the table and returned to the bedroom without saying anything. Sophia slept on her other side, sound asleep, oblivious to what had just happened. Daniel lay down, but didn't close his eyes. He spent the rest of the night listening to the ticking of the clock and the sound of the fan. For the first time, he felt fear of what was to come. In the following days, he didn't confront her. He didn't say anything. But something in him had finally gone silent. He began to observe in silence. The schedules, the glances, the last-minute disappearances. Everything made sense now. The pieces that had previously seemed disjointed now fit together like a cruel puzzle. Sophia was different because she no longer belonged to the same story. Daniel, however, didn't want impulsive answers. He wanted facts. He wanted certainties. He wanted protection from his own mind. And it was in this process of silence and vigilance that he decided to leave work early one night and stop by the hospital where she claimed to be on call. He bought her flowers, as he had in the early years of their marriage, the simple ones, but meaningful ones. He planned to surprise her, to show her that there was still love, in case this was all just an emotional drift. Maybe there was still time. Maybe there was still time to save what they were losing. He arrived at the location at 8 o'clock in the evening, parked discreetly, and watched the entrance. The minutes passed, people exited in groups, others hurried in. But she wasn't there. He waited longer. He even wondered if he'd misread the address of the on-call shift. But when he discreetly asked a receptionist, disguised as a lost visitor, he discovered there were no extra shifts for her team that day. He left silently, flowers still in hand, his stomach churning. The chill that gripped his body wasn't from the wind. It was the beginning of the end. In the days that followed, he began to piece things together. He remembered a new restaurant she'd mentioned once, saying she'd like to try it, but that she'd go with the girls from the hospital. He remembered a different perfume on his coat, a phone call that had ended too quickly when he'd entered the room. He remembered how she'd kissed him more quickly, as if it were a favor. Each memory now took on new weight. But still, he didn't speak. He needed one final piece of proof. Something that would leave no doubt. And she proved it without realizing it. One Friday, Sophia left home wearing an outfit Daniel had never seen before for a simple get-together with her colleagues. An incredibly elegant dress, high heels, and carefully applied makeup. She told him she'd be back late, not to wait. He nodded with a neutral smile, wished her a good night, and minutes later, drove off in another direction. He followed from afar. And she didn't go to the hospital. Nor to a bar with friends. She went into a restaurant downtown, the kind of place where dinners are held in dim light and couples gaze at each other for a long time. Daniel parked a little way away and walked to a position where he could see inside without being seen. When he looked out the window, he saw her. Sitting across from a man he'd never seen before. They were laughing. They were toasting. She touched his arm intimately. They smiled like two lovers. The wineglass between her fingers trembled slightly with laughter. Her eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in years. A sparkle that wasn't meant for him. He stood there for a few seconds. The scene struck him with a silent, devastating force. Time seemed to stand still. The conversations around him became noise. The sound of traffic, distant. It was as if there were a pane of glass between him and the world, and on the other side, his wife was living another life. There was nothing to think about, nothing to decide. Reality was there. Clear, raw, merciless. And yet, Daniel didn't enter. He didn't confront. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He simply watched for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. And when he took that first step, he felt he would never be the same again. He arrived home, sat on the couch, and stayed there. No television, no music, no light. Just him and the darkness. For the first time, he felt anger. But not that explosive anger. It was a cold, calm anger that comes when you realize something has been lost forever. The next day, he drafted the divorce petition. He didn't want lawyers, he didn't want legal confrontations. He simply wrote clearly that he was ending the relationship. And he left the letter on the living room table, next to his wedding ring. He left the house without saying anything. Without looking back. Sophia arrived hours later, smiling, her lipstick still intact. And when she saw the envelope on the table, something inside her trembled. She opened it with trembling hands. She read it. And then, all that was bright turned to silence. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to do. Because sometimes betrayal isn't discovered with screams or scandals. Sometimes, it's discovered in the most devastating silence anyone can experience. But what Sophia didn't yet know was that this wasn't the end. There was something behind that night, that dinner, that she hadn't yet understood. And when she found out, it would be too late to go back. Because not every forgiveness is a path back. Sometimes, it's just the door to moving on alone. Sophia didn't immediately respond to the divorce letter. She called, texted, searched, but Daniel had completely disappeared from the scene. He left no trace, only silence. And that silence, more than any words, was what began to eat away at her insides. It was no longer the discomfort of separation that had previously bothered her, nor the internal conflict over what she felt or didn't feel. It was now the raw, irreversible pain of loss. For the first time, she faced reality. The man she thought was always ready to forgive, to understand, to accept, was no longer there. And he wouldn't return. She tried to rationalize, to convince herself that he needed time, that it was a phase. But it wasn't. It was over. And she knew it. The morning she decided to seek him out in person was cloudy, stuffy, as if the weather itself sensed something would break that day. She learned from a mutual friend where he was living. She brought no flowers, no gift. Just her heart and a plea for forgiveness. When he opened the door, he was silent for a few seconds, as if he hadn't expected it, as if her presence brought to the surface everything he had so painstakingly kept bottled up. She asked to come in. He hesitated. But relented. They sat on opposite sides of the sofa, like two strangers trying to remember the intimacy that had once existed there. Sophia tried to begin, but her voice faltered. Then she took a deep breath and said what she'd been rehearsing for days. She admitted her mistake, explained that her involvement with the other man wasn't planned, that it began with innocent conversations, messages, and unpretentious laughter, and that in a moment of fragility, she found herself involved in something she never imagined she'd experience. She said she didn't want to justify it, but that she needed him to know it wasn't for lack of love. And when Daniel, who had been silent until then, asked with cutting calm why she had chosen that particular day to go out with the other man, she hesitated, lowered her gaze, and bit her lip, as if there was something she'd never said. He persisted, and for the first time, she trembled. Sophia said that week, she had received a message from that man saying he had feelings for her, that he needed to see her outside the hospital. She said she ignored it at first, but then, driven by a mixture of vanity, loneliness, and a desire to feel desired again, she gave in. She said it was curiosity, need, impulse. But what Daniel wanted to know was why that restaurant, that day. And then, Sophia's silence was more eloquent than any excuse. She tried to deny it, but then lowered her head and revealed what she had hidden from herself until then. It was no coincidence. She had chosen that restaurant because she knew there was a slim chance Daniel would pass by. She knew he liked the place, that they had gone there together years ago, and part of her, even if unconsciously, wanted to be seen. She wanted him to feel something, to realize she was still desired, that other men still saw her. The confession fell like a blade. Not because of what it represented, but because of its intention. It wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was emotional, it was symbolic. It was as if she had lit a bomb and waited for him to see it explode. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He walked to the window, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. His chest burned. Because now everything made sense. She wanted to be caught. She wanted to cause pain. She wanted him to react. But she hadn't expected him to leave. Sophia cried. She said she didn't know how she'd gotten to this point, that she no longer recognized her own choices, that she even missed his silence, his scent in the house, his simple coffee made with affection. He listened, but inside him, something remained unshakable. The pain had already become a scar. Sophia then held his hand, begged for a chance, said she was willing to rebuild, that the other man meant nothing, that everything that had happened had been a mistake, a lapse, a cry of despair for something she herself didn't understand. Daniel, with teary eyes, looked at her and told her he loved her, but that love alone wasn't enough. He said forgiveness existed, but it didn't guarantee return. And that, even though her heart still trembled, her soul needed peace. She begged, hugged, cried on his shoulder, and in that embrace, she felt she still loved him with everything she had. But she also felt it was too late. Because there, in the midst of that reunion, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before: liberation. The conversation lasted hours. They reminisced about good times, plans they'd made, trips that hadn't happened, promises left unfulfilled. Sophia said she'd never stopped loving him, and Daniel, his voice breaking, said she'd confused love with habit. That those who love don't hurt. And that, even though there was room for understanding, he couldn't go back to the place where he'd been destroyed. He said he needed to move on. And that now he knew how much he'd abandoned himself trying to hold on to something she'd already left behind long before the betrayal happened. Sophia left silently. Without scandal, without a scene. He returned to an empty apartment, where everything seemed to echo louder. She sat on the living room floor, staring into space, and for the first time felt what Daniel had felt that night he saw her with another man. She felt the weight of absence, of loss, of the consequence of a choice that could no longer be undone. The emptiness was now hers. The next day, Daniel decided to visit a new cafe he'd discovered weeks earlier. He brought a book, sat by the window, and let himself sink into the tranquility. Nearby, a woman read alone, her bare feet draped over the chair, oblivious to the world. Their eyes met by chance. She smiled. He smiled back. And in that instant, he realized that perhaps there was still life after the pain. He still didn't know her name. But he knew that smile didn't hurt. What Sophia never imagined was that that night at the dinner, that scene she planned without planning, would not only mark the end of her marriage, but also the introduction of something much crueler, much more devastating, something she would only discover weeks later, when life, in its relentless irony, confronted her with the true weight of her choices. Because the man sitting with her at that table was not just an unknown passenger, and what lay behind that encounter, was yet to come. 2 weeks had passed since the conversation that sealed the fate of a marriage that, in everyone's eyes, was solid and exemplary. Autumn painted the trees golden, and the wind carried a cold nostalgia, as if the city itself were in mourning. Sophia walked the streets with uncertain steps, carrying bags that didn't disguise the invisible weight on her shoulders. The guilt didn't just dwell within her, it fed on it. There were no more weekend plans, no "did you get home okay?" messages, no more the comfortable silence of the home they'd shared for over a decade. What remained now was echo, emptiness, and a constant feeling that something much bigger was about to happen. Since the night she'd begged for forgiveness and heard him say, with the cruelest serenity she'd ever witnessed, that he wouldn't return, Sophia hadn't slept a full night. She spent hours sitting on the living room floor with the lights off, mentally reviewing all the choices that had led her to that point. But there was a greater anguish, a loose thread that pulled her down, that consumed her more strongly than the loss itself. It was something related to the man she'd been involved with. She no longer wanted contact, didn't respond to his messages, and when she tried to sleep, she felt the bitter taste of shame remembering the conversations, the touches, the way she'd allowed herself to be seduced by a shallow fantasy. But there was something that bothered her deeply, the feeling of being used. The memories of how little he'd said about himself, how he'd always deflected when she asked about his past, how everything between them was intense and superficial at the same time. One day, mustering up the courage, she searched his social media, trying to understand what lay behind the seductive smile that had so easily enveloped her. It was then that something leaped out at her. An old photo, with a vague caption, posted months earlier, with a woman and 2 children. Her face partially obscured, but familiar. Sophia enlarged the image, and the chill down her spine was instant. She knew this woman. She was a former nursing colleague who had disappeared from the hospital months earlier after a scandal involving a messy divorce. Sophia's blood ran cold. That was his ex-wife. And the memory came back like a punch, the rumors that her husband had had a secret, manipulative affair with another woman at the hospital. The pieces began to fall into place, but not in the way Sophia had hoped. She hadn't just been unfaithful. She had been the next piece in a game already underway. Determined to understand, Sophia sought out her former colleague. She found an old contact in a forgotten group and sent a direct message, bluntly. To her surprise, she received a response the same day. They arranged to meet at a discreet coffee shop. When they saw each other, the atmosphere was tense, but their shared pain served as a bond. The former colleague, named Helena, didn't hesitate. She told her everything. She said the man Sophia had been involved with was manipulative, emotionally unstable, and that he had approached her in the same way, gentle conversations, calculated compliments, strategic attention. She said he preyed on the insecurity of the women he chose. That he liked to seduce, to have the power to make someone leave a stable relationship for his sake. That he collected stories like that. That he walked away after getting what he wanted. Helena said her divorce was devastating, and that he disappeared shortly after, leaving her with debts and deep scars. Sophia couldn't breathe as she listened. It wasn't just shame. It was humiliation. It was the certainty that he had destroyed everything he had for something that was never real. That night, after the encounter, Sophia walked the streets as if she'd lost her footing. The air seemed heavier, the world quieter. When she got home, the first thing she did was tear up all the photographs she'd saved of her lover. She deleted the messages, erased the photos from her phone, but she couldn't erase herself from that mess. The past was a ghost that now screamed. And in the midst of this abyss, one thought kept repeating itself: Daniel had seen the worst of her and yet he offered her forgiveness. She'd underestimated him. She'd underestimated the depth of his feelings. And now, all that remained was his absence and the pain of losing not only a husband, but the only man who had ever truly cared. Unable to keep it to herself, she decided to tell him. She needed to tell him. Not to seek reconciliation, but out of honesty. She needed him to know the whole truth, how he had been wrong, how it had all been a much bigger mistake than she had imagined. She went to the cafe she knew he frequented. She waited outside, watching until she saw him sitting, reading, relaxed. She approached slowly and excused herself. He looked at her with some surprise, but with serenity. She sat down. The silence between them lasted a full minute, and then she began to speak. She told him about her encounter with Helena, about the history of the man she had been involved with, about how it had all been an emotional trap. She said she understood that nothing justified what she had done, but that the truth needed to be told. As she spoke, Daniel watched her closely. But what she didn't expect was his reaction. He expressed neither anger nor compassion. He simply said that, somehow, he had already sensed something wrong in that relationship. That something about his behavior that night, in that restaurant, had seemed rehearsed, as if it were meant to be seen. And now it made sense. Daniel then looked deep into her eyes and said that, ironic as it was, knowing that freed him even more. He said that seeing how she, too, had been deceived and used, didn't give him pleasure, but it did give him peace. Because now he knew that the destruction of their marriage hadn't been solely her decision, but also the result of foul play by someone outside. Even so, that didn't change the ending. He was no longer there. He no longer felt the same. And she, through tears, acknowledged it. She said she didn't expect to return. That she didn't want to start over. She just wanted to apologize truly, to look him in the eye and say, "You were always the right one. I was the one who lost myself." At that moment, they both stood up. He hugged her tightly, intensely, like someone closing a book with respect. And when they pulled away, her eyes still pleaded, but his steps already pointed toward the life he'd chosen. Sophia stood there, watching him walk away, certain she'd never find such pure love again. Daniel walked toward the future with a new lightness. Not because he'd won, but because he'd understood that forgiving isn't about taking someone back. It's about freeing yourself from the pain the other person left behind. And he was, finally, free. Daniel left the cafe without looking back, walking through the streets as if the weight of the last few months had finally lifted from his shoulders. The conversation with Sophia, the revelation of the psychological game she had also been subjected to, and the recognition that, despite her mistake, she had genuine regret, all of this formed a fabric that time would not erase, but which now no longer had the power to hurt him. What had hurt before now merely echoed. It was like a scar on healed skin, visible, perhaps uncomfortable on certain cold days, but no longer throbbing. As he walked, he felt whole for the first time in a long time, as if he had finally emerged from a dark tunnel that was slowly consuming him from within. It was strange to realize that love, no matter how deep, was not always enough to keep two people together. The pain had not disappeared, but had transformed, taking on a different form, quieter, more serene. It hurt differently now. And, in a way, this brought him closer to himself. Weeks passed. Daniel continued his routine with a calmness that gradually stopped feeling artificial. Mornings no longer ached as they once did. Evenings, once occupied by circular thoughts, now gave way to reading, to movies he'd long wanted to see but never had the energy to coffee in new places, to small changes in the apartment that symbolized a new phase. He bought a bicycle. He began cycling through parks, feeling the wind on his face as if it were a silent rebirth. It was as if he were rediscovering his own identity, buried under years of a relationship that, though marked by love, had left deep scars of emotional abandonment. The rediscovery of his autonomy was gradual. There was no sudden rupture, but a slow and steady rebuilding. On the other hand, Sophia sank deeper into herself. The work was still demanding, the hours at the hospital were still long, but now there was something about her that no one could touch. Her colleague with the easy smile no longer smiled as before. The nurse, always willing to listen and soothe, now seemed distant, only physically present. She began declining invitations to get-togethers, avoiding group lunches, and exchanging deep conversations for automated responses. At home, the echo was deafening. The television was on low, the windows open, letting in a draft that only worsened the emptiness. She checked her phone frequently, even without expecting messages. She would even dial Daniel's number, but delete it before calling. He knew there was no more room for pleas. Forgiveness had already been granted, but not as she had dreamed. And that hurt more than any punishment. It wasn't abandonment that destroyed her, it was the love she still felt being returned gently, but without reciprocity. A love that said goodbye with dignity, and that for that very reason, tore her apart. In an attempt to escape herself, Sophia sought therapy. She needed to understand why she had cheated, why she had let herself get involved, why she had destroyed what was most precious to her. In the sessions, she uncovered old pains she had never addressed, needs she had grown up trying to fill with the admiration of others, fears she had disguised with forced autonomy. She discovered that she had never learned to deal with the boredom of long-term relationships, that she had confused stability with stagnation, that she had stopped nurturing love because she expected it to nourish her. She cried like never before, not for the loss of her marriage, but for having finally understood the woman she had become. And this truth was the most painful. There was no one else to blame. Not her lover, not Daniel. The ruin had begun within her. And now, she needed to rebuild not a relationship, but herself. Daniel, in turn, reconnected with old friends, reconnecting with contacts he'd let slumber while prioritizing his life as a couple. During one of these reunions, he also reconnected with someone. One in particular caught his eye. A college friend, Laura, had moved back to the city after years living abroad. The reunion was casual, but the atmosphere was different. She, now divorced, also carried her scars. The conversation flowed naturally. They laughed about old memories, talked about the paths that had separated and hurt them, and finally, about what they'd learned along the way. There was no rush between them, no neediness disguised as passion. It was light. It was sincere. And it was in this lightness that Daniel began to realize that perhaps it was possible to love again, without having to erase what he'd experienced before. With Laura, everything started slowly. Unpretentious dinners, walks in the park, late-night conversations about everything and nothing. Daniel felt he could be himself. There were no demands, just presence. It was different from what he'd had with Sophia, not better, not worse, just different. And that was enough. On a clear Saturday, during a street fair, he held her hand for the first time. There were no fireworks, no music playing in the background. There was peace. And that, for him, meant so much more. He understood, then and there, that moving forward wasn't about erasing the past, but about giving himself the chance to experience something new, without guilt, without burdens. Meanwhile, Sophia continued with her therapy, but the days were long. She had nightmares about that night at the restaurant, reliving Daniel's expression when he saw her, the way he walked away without screaming, without destroying, just leaving. She dreamed of a version where he fought back, begged to stay. But it was never like that. And that was what hurt her, he didn't hold her back. He set her free. And she, in her freedom, chose to make mistakes. The therapist helped her understand that love isn't guaranteed, that constant care is needed, that loving someone doesn't just mean desiring, but choosing every day. And she stopped choosing. Sophia understood now. Too late. She began writing letters to herself. I wrote in them everything I wished I had said, everything I wished I had done differently. In one, she wrote that she still loved Daniel. In another, she confessed that as much as she missed him, what hurt most was missing herself when she was with him. She discovered she had become someone she didn't recognize, and only after the loss did she realize how disconnected she had become from her true self. The greatest punishment wasn't the end, it was the mirror I now faced every day. Daniel didn't know about the letters, the sessions, or the daily regrets she experienced. He was focused on the present. He had learned that taking care of himself was also a way of respecting the love he once had. He didn't need to hate Sophia to move on. He didn't need to erase the past to write a new chapter. His soul was now fertile ground for new beginnings. With Laura, he began planning a short trip, something simple, to a nearby city. There was no rush. Just desire. And that was enough. While packing up some old things at home, he found a photo. It was of him and Sophia, smiling, embracing, on a winter trip. He stared at it for a while. He felt no anger. No pain. Only tenderness. He put the photo back away, not as a reminder of a lost love, but as a symbol of how much he had grown. I knew some stories don't end as we expect, but that didn't make them any less important. And deep down, I knew that story, though finished, still had one more page to come. The last. The one that closes not with sorrow, but with the maturity of someone who understands that love, however beautiful, when left untended, is lost. And sometimes, the greatest love is the one that lets the other go, even when you still want to stay. The phone rang in the middle of the gray afternoon, on one of those Mondays when time seems to carry in its clouds the weight of everything left unsaid. Daniel, seeing the name on the screen, hesitated. It was Sophia. They hadn't spoken since that conversation in the cafe. She respected the silence he'd requested, and he respected the time she probably needed to deal with her own ghosts. But now, there was her name again. His hand almost hung up on impulse, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end sounded calmer, yet shaky, as if held by a thread about to snap. She said she didn't want to intrude, that she wasn't calling to ask for anything, that she just needed to say something. Daniel took a deep breath, listened, and accepted her invitation for one last meeting, not at the cafe like last time, but in a more neutral place. She suggested the garden of the Museum of Modern Art, a quiet space where the sound of the trees usually muffles the pain the throat can't contain. She arrived before him, sitting on one of the stone benches, hugging her arms as if the cold were inside her. When he approached, she slowly stood up, and for a few seconds, they simply stared at each other. There was no tension. There was time. Time passed, time lost, time reflected. Daniel greeted her with a slight nod, and they both sat down. The surrounding garden seemed oblivious to what was happening between them, as if life continued at its own pace, while they tried to understand what was left of that story. Sophia, her eyes fixed on her hands, said there were no more excuses or justifications, but that she felt the need to share what she had learned. She spoke of the therapy process, the letters she had written to herself, the days when she couldn't get out of bed, the nightmares in which she relived the restaurant scene, but now from the outside, as a spectator of her own destruction. She said his forgiveness had been a cruel mirror, because it was so gentle that it exposed how miserable she felt. That it wasn't anger that tore her apart, it was his absence. Not in her body, but in her soul. Daniel listened attentively, but his expression wasn't one of pain or pity. It was that of someone who had weathered the worst of the storm and now simply observed the damage. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and said he admired her courage in admitting it all, but that he needed to be honest. He said that for years he had suppressed himself to keep his marriage going, that he often failed to express his feelings to avoid conflict, that he put himself on the back burner to make room for a woman he loved more than himself. And that now, for the first time, he was experiencing a different kind of love, self-love. He said he understood her regret, but he could no longer carry that burden. That he had learned that true forgiveness wasn't what appeases the other, but what frees oneself. Sophia lowered her gaze, held back the tears that insisted on falling, and asked, her voice almost fading, if he had met someone. Daniel was silent for a few seconds. He thought of Laura, thought of the light moments, the carefree laughter, the absence of pain by her side. And he answered yes, he had met someone, but that wasn't what mattered at that moment. Sophia smiled, sad but sincere. She said she was happy, even if it hurt. Because he deserved everything she couldn't give. And that she hoped, from the bottom of her heart, that woman would know how to care for him as she hadn't. Daniel simply nodded. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. And then Sophia took a letter from her bag. She said she had written it to him, not to be read then and there, but to be kept. Daniel accepted it but made no promises. He thanked her, and when they both stood up, they hugged for the last time. It was a long, sincere hug, without promises. It was a goodbye. But a clean goodbye. From someone who understood that love can also end with dignity. The next day, Daniel woke with a lighter heart. The past was now past. The wound had healed. And what remained was a silent peace that filled the spaces that had once hurt. He read her letter that night. He didn't cry. He read it with affection, with respect, with the serenity of someone who had made peace with everything. She spoke of the love she only understood after her loss, of the small gestures she never appreciated, of the conversations she selfishly ignored, of how alone she felt without him, even when surrounded by people. And in the end, she asked him not to forget who he was before her. Daniel folded the letter and put it in a box, along with other memories that no longer hurt. With Laura, the days continued to unfold with ease. She perceived in Daniel a rare sensitivity, a calm that came from someone who had weathered storms and learned to dance in the rain. She never asked about his past with Sophia, and he never hid it. There was transparency between them. There were no comparisons, only discoveries. They began planning a longer trip, perhaps a season abroad, perhaps a fresh start in another city. Daniel now lived the present intensely, but with both feet on the ground. He learned to appreciate the details, to respect his own limits, to not give in for fear of loss. The man he was now was not the same as before. And that was good. Meanwhile, Sophia continued rebuilding herself. She enrolled in a specialization course, began writing regularly, reconnected with old friendships, and gradually created a new version of herself. Not one that sought external approval, but one that looked inward with more compassion. There were difficult days, there were setbacks, there were moments when loneliness still screamed. But there was also strength. The pain had been profound, but the transformation it brought about was even more so. She began attending a support group for women who had been through traumatic relationships. There, she heard moving stories, shared her own journey, cried, and was welcomed. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was building something real from what had been broken. At one of these meetings, after a painful account of a young woman who had been abandoned after being betrayed, Sophia stood up and said something no one expected to hear from someone who had been the betrayer. She said that cheating wasn't just a mistake, it was an escape. And that running away from what's inside you is the most cowardly way to lose yourself. She said that what hurt her most wasn't the judgment of others, but having to live daily with the certainty that she lost someone who loved her completely, simply because she couldn't recognize that love. She said she now understood that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. And she, at the moment she needed to be most present, chose to be absent. Her words were moving. There was no applause, but rather looks of recognition. Because the truth, when spoken with humility, penetrates any defense. And in that moment, she understood that perhaps her story had a greater purpose, to serve as a warning, as a reflection, as a chance for transformation for other women. She decided she would write a book. Not a romance, nor a self-help book. But a book of truths. Hard, necessary, painful truths. And there began a new mission. Not to redeem herself, but to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Across town, Daniel and Lara were watching a movie, cuddled on the couch. It was an ordinary night, uneventful. But there was peace in his eyes. The peace of someone who has experienced great pain, survived, and chosen to continue loving. Not out of need, but by choice. And although the past still lingered in some corner of his memory, it was no longer a place of suffering, but of learning. Life went on. Their paths no longer crossed. But each followed their own path, carrying the baggage left behind by pain and the wisdom that forgiveness, even silently, offered. There was still one final chapter, an ending that wouldn't bring twists and turns, but rather the conclusion of all that life had to teach, with pain, with loss, but also with the chance for rebirth. Summer arrived quietly, bringing longer days, warmer nights, and a kind of calm that seemed unfamiliar to that history. Daniel walked among the stalls of a late afternoon market with Lara at his side, his fingers intertwined with hers in a natural, unpretentious gesture. There was laughter in his eyes and lightness in his gestures. The past, though still present as a memory, was no longer a wound. It was a lesson, tattooed with respect and resilience. He had understood that loving someone again didn't mean erasing what he'd experienced, but allowing his heart to become a home for new, more mature, more conscious affections. With Lara, there was mutual understanding, respected time, and a complicity that required no words. And that was enough. It wasn't blind passion, it was construction. Unhurried, with soul. One weekend, they decided to take a short trip. They climbed to a historic town, one of those with cobblestone streets and colorful houses, where time seems to move more slowly. Sitting at a lookout point, they watched the sun set behind the mountains, and in that peaceful silence, Daniel looked at her with the tranquility of someone holding something precious in his hands. He didn't promise eternity or perfection. But he said, in a firm, serene voice, that there by her side, he had rediscovered the best in himself. That he felt free, whole, and that he wanted to continue discovering what they could build together, without pressure, only with truth. Laura smiled, moved, held his hand tightly, and replied that she had already chosen to be there, every day. That simple, honest, and deeply human exchange sealed the new chapter of a story that was born from what seemed like an ending. On the other side, Sophia had released her book, Letters of Silence, a title that conveyed all the pain, guilt, and learning she wrote with the trembling fingers of someone who felt the weight of her choices firsthand. The publication went viral unexpectedly, not only for its painful and sincere content, but because many women saw themselves there, reflected in the pages like uncomfortable mirrors. Some expressed gratitude for finding the strength to rethink their lives before it was too late. Others expressed gratitude for the loss they could never explain. Sophia began to be invited to interviews, discussion groups, and support groups. Her pain became a bridge, and with it, she understood that her reconstruction could also be a path for others. But none of this erased the loneliness that haunted her at home. The book's success was real, people applauded her, but she knew that every compliment brought with it a silent reminder, none of it would bring Daniel back. And she didn't want another Daniel. She wanted this one. The one who knew her silences, her fears, the way he adjusted his glasses when he concentrated. She wanted the man she'd lost through distraction, through vanity, through believing that love was eternal in itself. Some nights, she still slept hugging an old t-shirt of his, now scentless but filled with memories. She learned to deal with it, not as a punishment, but as a reminder. Love needs to be nurtured. Neglected, it sickens. Disrespected, it dies. One afternoon, she was invited to give a talk at a school about emotional responsibility. As she spoke, she noticed a familiar face in the back of the room. It was the daughter of a mutual friend, a teenager who had grown up seeing Daniel and Sophia as a model couple. When she finished speaking, the young woman approached and said something that shattered her. She said she now understood that not every mistake has to be the end, but that some mistakes cost everything you love. And that I hoped one day to love someone who would choose to stay, even when everything seemed difficult. Sophia smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. The girl hugged her and left. Sophia stood there for a few minutes, her heart heavy, but certain that that hug carried a forgiveness she had never dared ask for. At the end of a month, he decided he would do something symbolic. He went to the place where he had met Daniel, a small bookstore that still existed, silent and filled with memories among the shelves. He entered, walked the aisles, smelled the pages, and allowed himself to remember. Not with pain, but with gratitude. He picked up a book he knew he loved, wrote a discreet dedication, and left it with the clerk. He asked her to give it to him if he ever passed by. He didn't know if that would happen, but it was his way of closing. Of giving back a little of what he had received. Of finally closing a cycle. Daniel never knew about the lecture, nor the dedication, nor the book left in the bookstore. Maybe one day I would. Maybe not. But what mattered now was the present. The story with Sophia was over, and the ending wasn't what she wanted, but it was what life coherently constructed. They both moved on. One with a new love, the other with a new version of themselves. Both forever marked by a story that couldn't continue, but that changed everything. There was no reunion, no recovery. Fate chose to offer learning, not reconciliation. Because happy endings don't always lie in the return. Sometimes, they lie in the courage to accept that what shaped us no longer belongs to us. And so, this story ends. A marriage destroyed not by a lack of love, but by neglect, vanity, and the empty pursuit of something already possessed but unappreciated. A betrayal that cost everything, that left scars but also profound lessons. A woman who saw her world crumble at her own hands and had to rebuild herself without guarantees. A man who rose from the ashes without needing to hurt in return. A new love that arose as a reward for patience and resilience. And a silence between two hearts that, even though far apart, still respect each other. If you've made it this far, please comment below with your thoughts on this story. We want to hear your thoughts, feelings, and if you've ever experienced anything similar. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and don't miss the next stories that will surprise and deeply move you. Remember, betrayal destroys much more than a relationship. It erodes respect, uproots trust, and slowly disintegrates love. A single choice can cause irreparable losses. No momentary passion is worth the pain of losing someone who truly loved you. And this channel does not support, encourage, or glamorize any kind of betrayal. Quite the opposite. We use these stories to show the consequences, the damage, and how important it is to value those by our side before it's too late.